I think we're all deeply sad. Many of us are feeling what I would call survivor's guilt, that we have our grandchildren and that in fact never saw his grandchild, that we're alive and others in Gaza and Lebanon are dead. But I want to try and lift our spirits a little bit. And I want to talk about two things. Many students have come to me at Columbia, which started a global movement that shifted the narrative in this country and in the world. And they are depressed, they are confused, many of them, especially the Palestinians and the Lebanese, are suffering what one of them talked to me today about as survivor's guilt. They feel that they put their all into the movement, the encampment, the occupation, the demonstrations that they launched last academic year, and that the war goes on. The killing continues. Musab just told you what happened today. You can open up your phones and you can see the toll every single day. And they're depressed, and they're confused, and they feel that all that they did was for naught. And what I've been telling every one of them who comes to see me is that, first of all, this is a long struggle. This is not going to end quickly. This is something that's going to take a very, very long time. And young people who exerted themselves beyond the limits of what they thought they were capable of and achieved something world historical last year are now disappointed that the murderers are murdering, that the enablers in Washington are enabling, and that the death goes on. But I want to say two things. First of all, they did something that we should never forget, and we should continue to credit them for. They started something that has had a profound long-term effect. The narrative that they were fighting against will never be the same. Never be the same. They cannot mouth those cheap, filthy, low lies the way that they have been doing again and again and again through the corporate mass media, through the spokespersons in the National Security Council, and through the Israeli government's media. Those things don't work anymore. And it's partly because of what these young people did on these campuses. Starting at Columbia, continuing throughout campuses across the United States, and eventually all over the world. And I try and tell them this, and I don't think I'm having much of an impact on them. They're still depressed, but I'm telling them this is a long-term struggle. This is not going to end quickly. They're young, they're impatient, but they have to, and I'm trying to make them see that we are actually changing the narrative. That's the first thing I want to say. They have done something that actually has never happened in this country before. I'm a historian. I can tell you that since Woodrow Wilson, that racist president who showed Birth of a Nation in the White House, who fired every black person in the federal government, that stone-cold redneck racist, ever since Woodrow Wilson, ever since the First World War, there has never been a time when American public opinion has been so negative towards Israel and has had any appreciation for Palestine. This is very important. This is very important. It has not changed the elites. It has not changed the government. It has not changed the disgusting corporate legacy media. It hasn't changed the donors who run our universities, but it has changed public opinion. It will not change back. They cannot sell the old, lousy, worm-eaten goods. Land without a people for a people without a land. Making the desert bloom. Only democracy in the Middle East. That stuff doesn't work anymore. And it's partly because of work that's been done over many, many years, but it's by Edward Said, by Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, by a whole host of people who've been working for decades. But it's also largely thanks to these students. And that's the first thing I want to say. We should not be discouraged. It is a depressing, discouraging moment. We read the news from Gaza and we say, we're in our 14th month. How can this continue? I lived through 10 years of war in Lebanon. Nothing like what they've suffered in Gaza. Nothing like what they've suffered in Gaza. But one of the things we learn is it can always get worse, and it may get worse. It will probably continue. But there is a trajectory which is a trajectory of hope. And I think we have to keep that in mind. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that what we've been listening to tonight in the way of poetry and narrative and stories and literature and acting and art and theater and movies is more important than what I do as a historian or what journalists do or what academics do. I mean, we've done our part. We've helped to change the narrative. But what people like Rifat, what people like Musab, what people like the folks that I hope you'll buy their books and spread them are doing is much more fundamental. It gets the humanity of the Palestinians, it gets the narrative of the Palestinian people through in a way nothing I write, nothing Edward wrote, nothing any of us wrote can do. We played our part. I'm playing my part. Allah yarhamu. Edward played his part. Ibrahim, Allah yarhamu, played his part. And that's important. We've changed academia. The garbage that used to be published cannot be published anymore. And that's the work of academics. But reaching people is not done through monographs. It's done through literature and art and film. And the stuff that Rifat did, the things that he did through the books that I hope you'll all be buying and that I hope will be spreading all over the world, are going to continue that work. More things have been published in the last few years, memoirs, poetry, literature of different kinds, by Palestinians and about Palestine, than I've ever seen in my entire life. I was born in this city. I followed what was published in this country. Nothing was published of almost any worth, with a very few exceptions, for decades and decades and decades. And what's been published in the last 10 or 15 years is an amazing cornucopia. And people are reading it. The publishers wouldn't be publishing it if it weren't selling, ladies and gentlemen. That means there's an audience out there. That means people are open to a narrative that they never heard before. And the rubbish, the stuff that used to fill their minds, the Exodus, the film, the book, that stuff doesn't work anymore. And what Rifat has written and what other people are writing is going to have an effect that none of us who write the kind of things that I write are able to do. So I want to encourage you to understand that what we're doing here is something that could never have been done before in New York City or in the United States 10 or 20 years ago. These things didn't happen. These books weren't published 20 years ago. The fact that this is happening it's not a miracle. It's the result of a lot of people doing a lot of hard work. Publishers, writers, journalists, in some cases academics. But I think the writers are more important. And that's why we honor Rifat al-Haidia. Because I think he represents, with his pen, something that's going to lead sooner or later, inshallah sooner, but sooner or later, to the liberation of Palestine. Thank you very much.